Getting re-enthused. Getting re-enthused. Getting re-enthused. Getting re-enthused.
I asked a question on Blue Sky and Mastodon recently and thought it'd make a little piece about the results. The question was, what if you were working at Sinclair Research in the 80s and Clive Sinclair told you that you could design the Sinclair Spectrum and money was no object? The company would soak up the costs and sell the resulting machine cheap enough. For context, in case you don't know the history of the Sinclair Spectrum, Sir Clive Sinclair was very keen on making machines that were affordable to as many people as possible, bringing computers to the masses. This meant the Specky had a few compromises to keep those costs low. Before we go into the results, I'll address a couple of key responses that cropped up. Any big changes to the Spectrum would mean it wasn't a Spectrum anymore. I fully agree with this. The Spectrum was cheap for a reason. I've said many times, but my family were poor, and without the Specky, I doubt I'd have had the great start that got me into an engineering career. And it's the limitations, the 48K of memory, the tape loading, the color clash, the beeper that made it a Spectrum. It meant we had to find clever ways to do stuff as developers. And absolutely 100%. But the question comes from a point in history where the Specky isn't the beloved classic we know it is now. We're developing the successor to the ZX81 and we want the best machine we can muster. Replace the Z80 with X processor. The Z80 is staying because I do think it's a valid choice at this time in history. It was still a mainstream processor and many machines proved it was capable as a home computing CPU. And also, I'm only looking at parts that made sense for the time, not in a cost sense, but in an availability sense. For instance, the Hitachi ARTC HD 63484 was an amazing graphics solution, but it didn't come out until 1984, and as such would have made no sense for the Specky. Anyway, to the responses. We can break them down into 5 main areas: memory, graphics, sound, storage, and basic reliability. So, kicking off with memory. The original Spectrum had 16K memory with an upgrade to make it 48K, but really it's probably better known as 48K guys. Part of the reason for having 48K was due to the cost, with Sinclair using rejected memory chips for some of its lifetime, pairing groups of chips with failed upper memory and groups with failed lower memory in machines, and then little switches that let you choose which type of memory it was. The other reason being the Z80 was only capable of addressing 64K memory anyway, a problem that would be solved with banking in later machines. And in fact, using that solution, we can use an almost infinite amount of memory, really. Banking was a known technique at the time, and it allows us to, theoretically at least, use any amount of memory just by swapping in 32 or 48K banks of memory at a time, or even down to 16K or 8K, whatever. But let's hold to 256K of memory. Other Z80-based machines of the time used that amount to good effect. Possibly a more important use for that memory comes in the next section, which is graphics. One of the most iconic, beloved and derided features of the Sinclair Spectrum was its problem with color clash. The attributed layout of the screen meant it was difficult to use color in a very accurate way. There are a number of ways of fixing that. All of them require changing the underlying structure of the Specky, of course. The basic design uses an attribute layout system that causes the main issues. So assuming we're fine doing that, one of the first things is some kind of dedicated graphics memory. It doesn't have to be much, but it makes dealing with a nice color bitmap display a lot easier. Next, we can either improve the ULA to use this new system, or we can go the whole hog and use a dedicated graphics chip, or both, of course. What we now call a GPU have technically existed since the 1970s, dedicated silicon for handling graphic, like Atari's TIA and Antic chips. I'm going to choose the NEC 7220. Whilst it was really designed to be used with Intel chips, there were examples of it being used with the Z80, or at least its clones in both Japan and also the Eastern Bloc. Initially designed to allow clear presentation of kanji text, the chip supports either a character-based mode or an all-points addressable graphics display. Right, sound. Some of the developers on the Spectrum pulled off some insane tricks with the humble speaker that constituted its only audio source, but I don't think anyone would argue it was mostly dreadful. Not just because of its limited range, but also because it took processing power away from whatever else the Specky was doing. A couple of suggestions here, doubling up the ULA so we have one dealing with graphics and one dealing with sound, and of course using a dedicated sound chip. Now, obviously, if we look ahead in history, the Speccy would eventually have a sound chip. The Toast Rack and subsequent machines would have the venerable AY38910, either in its General Instruments or Yamaha guises. We could, of course, go down the self-created route, largely what happened with the SID, but honestly, I don't see a problem with staying with that chip. It was widely used in the 1970s in arcades, so it was already an established and capable sound solution. Right, storage. The Speccy has an interesting relationship with storage. Obviously, the tape was the medium we most associate with the Sinclair Spectrum. It was cheap and there were a ton of existing companies making them and also mass writing them. The Speccy also had a microdrive, of course. Oddly, nobody seems to be in favour of bringing that forward. Well, one person maybe, but nobody else. And largely forgotten, it had an official cartridge solution in the form of the Interface 2. Probably not a dead loss, the cartridge, especially if we assume we're going to have this built-in memory banking. It would allow for larger cartridges if we could swap that memory in and out. But of the day, we really need to look at disk support. And it's here where we hit a problem. As I explained in my videos on the Plus 3 and Amstrad CPC line, whilst we see this 3.5-inch disk drive as being the obvious choice now, it wouldn't have been seen as such in 1980. Sony's format was one of many in the struggle to be the successor to the 5.25-inch drive. In fact, the 5.25-inch drive was part of that fight as well. So we have potential choice of 3-inch, 3.5-inch, and 5.25. Any of these, and a few others, would have been seen as viable storage solutions in the early 1980s. And in fact, the 3-inch wasn't available till 1982. Even that might be pushing it in terms of the design timeframe of the Sinclair Spectrum, as is the case with the 3.5-inch, of course. So controversial as it might be, 5.25-inch would probably be the most obvious choice if we're looking very early in 1980. But if we assume development did continue in 1982, which, yeah, is entirely possible, then we're probably following Lord Sugar's lead and going for the 3-inch, just for size reasons, so we can don't give Dickinson too many headaches. Right, the last section is basic reliability, and we're going to call this basic reliability and miscellaneous section because there were quite a few issues with the Speccy, mostly due to its low cost. Adding or removing anything from that expansion port in the back would almost certainly blow a few things up if you still had it plugged in. So some voltage protection would be really good in that area. In fact, while we're at it, let's change it from being an edge connector to being actually a card edge slot so that it's slightly more stable and a bit more professional looking. Overall, better construction is nicer. Speaking as a future person that has to sometimes desolder stuff from a Spectrum PCB, not having things just disintegrate would be great. And of course, a decent OS. This would have to come for the built-in support for disk drives, of course, because we do need that operating system. And more expandability. One edge connector really isn't enough. And a big one that came up a lot is a power switch. I wholeheartedly agree with that one. The reset button on the Plus upwards was a brilliant addition, but we had no power switch at all through the range. And it's such a simple thing that you kind of, yeah, I mean, even Amstrad, why didn't you add it? What's going on there? And also with this, if we're going to be cutting more holes in the case, another video option. We need RF. Absolutely, you've got to have RF in there. It's easily the most available option in the UK at this time. But what about we also add composite? With the advent of video cameras and video recorders, it was fast becoming a very accessible option. And that's it. There were many other responses. This is really just a condensed view of what I got back. And again, I'll explain, this isn't an attack on the Spectrum. The Speccy was designed at low cost to be low cost for a very good and very correct reason. The decisions made enabled so many more people to get on the home computer train than would have been possible if the price had been higher. So rather than thinking of this as being making a better Spectrum, think about what if those conditions weren't in play in the 1980s. Anyway, this is my view. Almost certainly you have your view, so please feel free to give me your views in the comments. We should be back if I get my finger out my arse and actually sort it out, the next podcast should be me talking with John Brown of Retro Bytes. Subscribe to find out when that comes out. See you next time.
The present is horrible. The future looks bleak. Remember our childhood to get us through the week. We're getting re-enthused. Back to the past and the things we used. We all know that our pasts were great. Escaping the things that today we hate. Getting re-enthused. Getting re-enthused. Getting